Let's see how you did at analyzing the cases that we left you with before the break. This person that we started with, you probably noticed, first of all, in terms of their arousal temperature, it's about twice as high as the individual we had previously. Right here, they're getting at about 22 on the scale, whereas our previous person was at roughly 10. So if we're assuming there's a sort of a standardized amount of anger, and there isn't, but if we're using that metaphorically, we can see this person is being charted as being particularly high in their level of arousal. We can also see that we have noted this individual as being aroused over a period of about 9 minutes altogether. And that's not a very long arousal time. So in other words, this individual has calmed down within approximately 9 minutes, and their arousal was at its peak at approximately 5 minutes. So that's a pretty, or 4.5, 5 minutes. So that's a pretty extreme amount of arousal in a short period of time. You can also see that if you were working with this individual, you would have to be really astute to catch what they were doing in their most mild states of arousal, because it's very, very difficult to detect at this point. Even their stage 2 is not terribly prominent, but they certainly are prominent by the time they get right here into their stage 3, a very quick escalation. All of this represents stage 4. You can see that, excuse me, that they're calming down in a more gradual way than they get agitated. But still, over the period of about 5 minutes, they're calming down, and we would say this is not a person who's likely to hold a grudge. And they're mildly depressed and mildly more focused, but then they seem to maintain to their stable level. You have to remember that in the course of a person's life, this is just a snipped out section of that individual's arousal cycle, and that they may have many, many of these over the course of a day, or may not have many for a month at a time, depending on the individual. So we don't want to only look at an individual portion of the arousal cycle. We want to also think about how often a person is aroused, because that in and of itself can be very taxing on the social and physical systems around an individual. Our next one is a person who gets upset over a period of hours. And at first blush, we might assume this person's agitation, this person's arousal cycle, is very scary because it seems basically jagged and harsh. But when we look at it relative to the others, we can see this person's arousal level is more or less at about a 3.5 out of a much higher possible 22 for the person previously. And further to that, this individual's arousal time is in the neighborhood of approximately 20 hours from arousal to calm down. When you think about the fact that this person took about 13 hours to become at their peak, and their peak is only about a 3.5, and then they calmed down within a space of about 5 hours, it's pretty amazing to think about this individual compared to the last one, because this is a person for whom we would never ever need to sit down and most likely do a crisis intervention plan for. They are very slow to get angry, very quick to calm down, and when they get angry, they don't get very angry at all. So this person's arousal cycle would probably indicate that they don't need to have a crisis intervention procedure developed. Our last person is far more extreme. This individual, if we again assume that we're using a relative scale, gets agitated to about 50, about twice as much as our previously high person. But even more daunting, this person's time occurs in seconds, and you can see, although we don't again have a scale at the bottom, that this individual is getting agitated and calmed down within the space of perhaps 10 to 30 seconds. This sounds like it's impossible, but in truth, this is quite possible if you've ever supported individuals who have intermittent explosive disorder, or even you might see something that looks similar to this with people who have Tourette, for example, whose behavior is not actually based entirely on anger as much as it is on ventilating tick energy and getting rid of that stress very, very quickly. The more people bottle up that tick energy, the more radically and more extremely, especially for younger people, it might be expressed. And so this is part of the reason when people have disorders like IED and Tourette's syndrome, we need to think about scheduling supports and things that we can do to help people ventilate their tensions and stresses much of the time in small and moderate ways that are socially acceptable, so that they don't have these radical outbursts. And I've worked with people who are very, very mild-mannered most of their day. Out of 30 days in a month, they would spend 5 minutes in an agitated state. And the other 30 days, 23 hours, or sorry, 29 days, 23 hours, and 55 minutes, they were very, very calm, very easy to get along with. But the fact was that after assessing that individual's ability to get there, we realized we need to find ways to deal with that individual's mental health needs on a proactive basis, preventatively, getting them involved in physical activity, getting them opportunities to, for example, to participate in psychotherapy if that was something that was going to work for that individual, and thinking about things like medications, like anxiolytic medications that would help a person to dissipate some of that anxiety. We're going to begin by looking at each of the individual stages in order, starting with stage 1, which is called the trigger phase. And at the end of each stage, we're going to have you build on the blog entry you did around your homeostasis behaviors. So we'll ask you to look at how you think you look to others in each of these phases. Stage 1, as I said, is the trigger phase, and it is characterized by mild anxiety. As the name suggests, the trigger phase is the phase in which a person is responding early on to the trigger or stimulus, the thing that makes them upset. Now, many of us will describe that the level of our eventual arousal will get higher if the stressor or trigger is more important or more significant. But initially, at least, we don't necessarily have a very strong reaction. We can be characterized by mild anxiety, and as we said earlier, some people's mild state may last for seconds, while others may last for weeks or even months. So in this stage, the person is starting to become upset and still has considerable rational ability. This rational ability becomes very important because during the course of any given day, it's likely that you experience mild anxiety on a temporary or transient basis many, many times, and you simply use your normal rational ability to get yourself back on track. And this is why, as an adult, you have fewer crying bouts or moments of temper than you did as a child. You simply have more coping skills, more things that you have memorized and learned that you can address, or you can use, I should say, to address stress. So when you don't get something you want, you have adept social skills for navigating, or you know about alternative things that you might get instead. If you're sitting in traffic, you know how to utilize things like distractions or to plan alternate routes, just to name a couple of examples of how you get yourself emotionally back on track. There are often very subtle signs that a person is in their trigger phase, and these are often evident only to people that know the subject well. So, if we're coming on the scene as crisis interveners, we have two choices. One is to ask other people who've gotten to know that individual, or to watch and respond to how other people are intervening. I guess there's a third choice, and that is to not intervene at all and to let the person move into their higher escalation. And unfortunately, I do see this happen too often. In fact, sometimes I think people are purposely going in and aggravating the individual further just so they have something to respond to. As we said, it can last seconds or months. And what we want you to do now is write in your journal what your triggers are. What do you do when you're in this state? And we'll give you a hint. Most people, when they're in their trigger phase, do the same things that they do every day, but they do them perhaps more quickly, more frequently, or for a longer duration, or for more intensity. So think of the things that you do that other people might respond to. The other thing that I want to give you as a hint is that often these things are evidenced in more of a physiological response, such as what happens to your breathing or the color of your skin. Take a moment and write down what you believe your trigger phase behaviors are, keeping in mind that they're the sorts of things that usually, with a little bit of support or even just some time on your own, you can figure out quite quickly and get yourself back on track. After you're done, come back and we'll look at stage 2.